Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. Our nation is suffering from several extremely serious problems all at once. This month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives will grapple with some of these many crises that our nation is experiencing right now. These crises are deeply rooted, and they actually go beyond individual elected officials or political parties. But instead of just merely lamenting what's wrong, we will also provide smart insights into these problems, and we'll also lift up some positive values that can help us solve them. And we'll propose some strategies that will help us create the solutions that our nation needs. Grassroots people can indeed take the leadership in solving difficult problems, and that's what we'll do during this hour. We have three guests to help us do all of this. All three guests have long backgrounds of accomplishments in working for peace and social justice and other issues, and I respect all three of our guests and their savvy insights. I'm happy to welcome Jean Gant Delastrada, Liz Moore, and Glen Gersmel. Jean Gant Delastrada is a compassionate person who organizes for various issues, and she sees the connections among various issues. At the end of 2017, when I stopped volunteering for the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation, Jean became the prime organizer for the Olympia FOR. Recently, we've worked together on nuclear weapons and other issues. Liz Moore is director of the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, PJALS. I've appreciated PJALS' work since its founding in 1976. Liz and PJALS have smart insights into multi-issue strategizing and local organizing. Glen Gersmel is ending a long tenure as the coordinator of the nationwide Lutheran Peace Fellowship. He is the only guest for this interview who has served as a guest on previous TV programs, and he always has wise insights, and I always like to hear what he has to say. I'm glad that all three are here, and you folks will enjoy meeting these folks as well. Public opinion polls keep saying that most Americans think our country is headed in the wrong direction. This has been going on for a number of years and is getting worse now. Everybody knows that our nation is suffering from multiple crises at the same time now. Most of these crises have existed for decades or longer, and they are entrenched in our political, cultural, and economic systems. Over the years, both of the big political parties have made them worse, regardless of who is president and regardless of which party is running Congress. Most of these crises have gotten much worse in just the past few years. Our guests will discuss about a dozen of these crises, and in addition to those, we do not have time to focus on some of the other serious problems, such as the widening gap between extremely rich people and everybody else, a political and electoral system that favors the rich and big business and refuses to serve the broad public interest, persistent failure to reduce gun violence, a dysfunctional healthcare system that fails to cover everybody, fails to control costs, and produces worse health outcomes than dozens of other nations, and ownership of mass news media is consolidated in fewer and fewer hands, typically giant corporations and right-wing political owners. So there are many other issues too, but we'll get into about a dozen of these, and I'm happy to hear from our guests and discuss not only problems, but also generate solutions. Gene, let's start with you here. When we were preparing for this interview, you mentioned that the current coronavirus pandemic has a domino effect on other issues that have been plaguing our nation for a long time. And would you tell us how you see the pandemic's relation to those problems?
I think that anxiety is one of the key drivers of exacerbating all the problems we already had because of coronavirus, but also I think everyone's heard the publicity about people of color and poor people being more susceptible to the virus. So those issues are exacerbated by it, and housing. People living on the streets are not getting the same kinds of support they were getting. It is a domino effect where things that were not working very well to begin with are falling apart more because of this.
Yeah, thanks. Glenn, when we were preparing for this interview, you mentioned problems of poverty and economic inequality. What can you tell us about these?
Well, there's of course a range of things. I'll just touch on a few. There are lots of people that don't have enough food every day. I worked at a meal program for the homeless, and it was astonishing to get to know people and to realize that they were very similar to me in a lot of ways, but they just had some bad luck in their work and were now didn't have enough food on the table. A lot of other people are losing freedoms, or they don't have the capacity to get out and visit friends other than nearby. Of course, it's been made a lot worse by virtually all of the tax cuts that have happened in the last few years have disproportionately benefited the top 1%, to the point of one of them even had, it was several $1 trillion more that they were getting than the rest of us. And it's just astonishing to see how people who have power not only are getting more, but they have more of an ability to expand their power and to turn their existing power into future benefits and dollars and successes and so forth. And their process is not that complicated. I mean, a lot of them, it's just they grew up with money, their family has it. Maybe political connections are playing a role in it. But it's just astonishing to see how unequal our world is.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that power differential. That's going to probably be a recurring theme as we talk through a number of these issues. As we say, all of these issues are interconnected, and Gene started us out thinking about that, and now you've added the power differential that is really going to be a recurring theme. Trump keeps saying, "Oh, as soon as we reopen the economy and the economy is going to come roaring back," and it's not. I mean, this is just another wishful thinking or another lie. Because so many of these jobs that have been lost and so much of the economic damage that's been done to people is so deep that a lot of these businesses will never come back to life. A lot of these jobs will never come back. And even if people do eventually get back to work after having been unemployed for a long, long stretch of time, they're not going to be able to jump back into having discretionary income again. They're not going to be able to go out and buy a new car because they've been so long with no income that the discretionary income is not there to be going to restaurants or buying furniture or cars and whatever, vacations and things. What else could anybody add? Liz, anything you could add, or Jean, to the economic crisis that we've got?
I think another really important aspect is the reality of mass incarceration and how obviously we see huge disparities with the criminal system targeting Black men, in particular Latinx men, Indigenous men, and that system has now been dramatically expanded to increase its targeting of undocumented people as well. And so, particularly during a pandemic, building on Jean's point around the mass incarceration is absolutely incompatible with public health during a pandemic.
Yeah.
And so the risks of the realities of incarceration increase the risk to people of color and low-income people. At the same time, the cracks in the healthcare system are certainly showing right now, to put it very mildly, really exacerbating the lack of access of immigrant communities, low-income communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, to even access testing, to have the deal with the lack of cultural competency to accomplish contact tracing among communities of color. So all of those structural barriers are showing in different ways right now that speak to where they've been the whole time.
I think a lot of ordinary people are starting to get that message if they see news reports about just the horrendous rates of COVID-19 infections in prisons and jails and other kinds of evidence that's out there. There's this the economic crisis that you folks have mentioned. Wages peaked in this country in about 1976 in relation to inflation, and they've been declining ever since then. And we have people in our society that say, oh, we should be blaming the immigrants, or we should be blaming women that want to get into the workforce and take men's jobs, or we should blah, 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 blah. But we need to look at the role of big business and some politically powerful entities that have made this economic disparity even worse. And we need some really profound remedies that go way beyond just blaming other people who are looking for jobs too. We need to support workers' rights to form unions, for example. Jean, when we were preparing for the program, you mentioned that homelessness is serious, already was serious. Even before the pandemic, we had 500,000 Americans with no place to live, and now it's escalating. What else can you mention about homelessness? You've already mentioned some.
Mm-hmm. Well, the cities in the country, certainly Olympia, where I live, and Seattle, are being overwhelmed because we're known to be friendly to the homeless, and the government is not helping adequately. So individuals have people camping on their properties, and because of the the freeze in evictions for landlords, a lot of people are about to have to start paying rent again and may not be able to. So they're going to add to the number of homeless. And I've read that what we can expect is not only external immigrants, but internally displaced people to increase more, because of this, that it's related to jobs, it's related to the price of housing going up, which it's continuing to do. So it just is logical that more and more people are going to be homeless.
Yeah, a lot of people have been priced out of the cities where they have been living, like Seattle and others that have big increases in housing prices, housing costs, and they get pushed out. And this is not just Seattle, but it's lots of places. And we see this with city councils that do gentrification policies, including Olympia doing that. Liz, when we were preparing for this interview, you expressed concern about the militarization getting worse in our society, not only militarization related to foreign policy, but also in the federal budget, which relates to the economics that we've been talking about, and in our nation's culture, and certainly the militarization of police, which we'll talk about in a moment. What can you help us see the scope of this militarization crisis?
So at the base of it, it's important to know that throughout multiple presidential terms with both parties, the military budget, which really consists not of equipment for soldiers, that's sort of the idea that many people may have about what is the military budget, that actually is less than half of the military budget. Most of the military budget is profit for weapons developers.
Yeah.
That's really, it's an R&D budget, a research and development budget, and what it means is war profiteers who are creating more weapons and better weapons, or at least more expensive weapons, and doing so in ways that are removing resources from our communities. The cost of war calculator from the National Priorities Project shows how many billions of dollars have gone into the 19 years of occupation in Afghanistan and 17 years of occupation and war in Iraq. And when we think about what we could do in our communities, particularly right now, where resources for folks who need rental assistance in order to have housing stability are at the need is at a crisis level, we could be doing so much with the billions of dollars that is instead lining the pockets of war profiteers. So we're seeing over half of our federal discretionary budget going to current and past military spending.
Yeah.
And Martin Luther King famously referred to that as the demonic destructive suction tube of military spending.
Yeah.
Very graphic language for someone who is known for very beautiful oratory. It is a demonic destructive suction tube that sucks in men and money.
Yeah.
But it's really, it's an education draft in our country, that it's a poverty draft in our country. Here in Spokane, the only school that has a junior ROTC program is the school that is the most highest density of low-income kids with parents who are justice involved, kids who need more resources to take an equity approach, but instead what they get is additional recruitment into the military.
Right.
So
Yeah,
that's one of the ways that militarism plays. And the more that that's normalized, the more that that affects our expectations about our government and about our what we can accomplish in our communities.
Right. When we were on the phone to prepare for this conversation, and you mentioned King's quotation about the demonic sucking tube, I searched the web and found that's the exact quotation he has. And he said at that time that in the early 60s, efforts had been afoot in the federal government to fight poverty and to solve problems. But he says, then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the programs broken and eviscerated as if they were some political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So, I mean, he really nailed it. he's doing, what we're doing on the program is linking up these issues and showing how really destructive they are. Glenn, I appreciate your long decades of concern about our nation's violent foreign policy and the excessive military spending. And beyond what Liz said just now, is there anything else you can add about our militaristic foreign policy or excessive military spending?
Well, one thing is that it doesn't only take money from roads and emergency aid and ambulances and fire trucks and schools and programs for the elderly, post offices, parks, libraries, but there's a bigger picture or a different picture. If you ask the question, what brings security? It's not just defense. In fact, the other two would be diplomacy and development, which get a tiny fraction of the amount of money that defense gets. But everybody knows that if you've got a problem that you're trying to resolve, it's crucial that you're putting some energy and money into negotiating your way out of it, and also into dealing with underlying problems like poverty and homelessness and so forth. I mean, most of the crises that we've seen in Egypt and Syria and Israel and all of these other places, if you dig into it, it doesn't take you too long to discover that the poorer of the combatants are often, having a whole lot of people in their communities that are very, very, very poor, that are even dying from starvation, not just feeling, food, the food crisis. So we need to be putting more money into diplomacy and development, and understanding that security is a broader thing than just military weapons. It doesn't, everybody knows that those aren't the solutions to an awful lot of problems.
Right. Yeah, I don't, regardless of how many nuclear weapons we have, they did not prevent the coronavirus pandemic. The vast number of nuclear weapons we have has not prevented the climate crisis, has not helped people with literacy. And decades ago, Sweden, which actually has a large military budget, figured out that if you're looking at just what makes Sweden secure, they need to be protected from environmental destruction in other parts of the world, in Africa and parts of Asia and so forth, because when people have serious environmental problems, they can no longer use farming to meet their needs, and you end up with environmental refugees and hunger and stuff that causes international turmoil and massive refugee problems and all kinds of stuff. So Sweden as a nation figured out that they need to put about 10% or more of their military budget into helping environmental problems in those parts of the world that are most seriously affected by worsening environmental conditions, because that actually would be good for Sweden's security. So they see the big multi-issue approach. I don't know if they've maintained that in recent years. This was a couple of decades ago when I heard that. I want to move on back to Liz about another one of these crises that we've got going on. In 1619, 400 years ago, the first ship bringing African slaves to the United States arrived in Virginia. And now, even a century and a half after the Civil War, our nation is still plagued by racial injustices. And I know that's something all four of us care about. But a lot of Americans pretend like racial injustice no longer exists, and some people are actually provoking more of it. And Liz, I wonder if you could address issues of racial injustice, perhaps including its entanglement with other issues. And we mentioned this just a little bit already. Can you flesh this out a bit?
Sure. And I think what I want to start by saying is that these what we're calling crises now are actually exposures of toxic violent systems. They're not, none of these issues that we're talking about are things that just erupted all by themselves like a volcano. Yeah. They're more like earthquakes that exist on fault lines that are actually rumbling all the time. So, you know, this country was founded on genocide, land theft, and slavery. These are the bones of the country. The stories that began to be told to justify those methods of exploitation and concentration of wealth still influence public policy today in terms of seeing who is worthy and who is not, who belongs and who does not, who is seen as part of a community and who is seen as the other. Those stories that began to be told to create the concept of race and racism in this country are tremendously powerful today. And so I think in a lot of ways it can be counterproductive to think of it as a racial justice crisis that erupted this summer with the killing of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. It's much more that these are the symptoms that are, you know, at the cost of people's lives. People began to be able to, other white people began to actually witness the symptoms of this toxic system that has been rolling forward, and at the cost of the not only the health but the lives of people of color. We know that when we look at any measure of socio and economic well-being in this country, any measure at all, whether it's life expectancy or income or educational attainment, any measure of social economic well-being, we see that there is a fault line along the lines of race in this country. And often as white people, as a white person, I have often been shown a picture that says, there's racism in the US, it's this picture over here. But in reality, I'm not walking through a museum looking at a picture on the wall. We're all in this picture together, and we have to recognize how imbued all of our systems are with white supremacy culture that dehumanizes Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and lifts up and benefits and pays off white people so that we don't, so that we have an incentive not to see the system.
Right. Yeah, the organizing that you and PAJALS have done, the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane, builds upon that kind of consciousness, and you've done some really smart organizing. Can you give us, and we're tight on time, but can you give us something of how you've strategized and organized and what you've been accomplishing?
Sure. For the past 6 years, we've been involved in a coalition called Smart Justice Spokane that is dedicated to ending mass incarceration and systemic racism in our city county criminal system. The most important way that we strategize is by being quiet and by listening, by prioritizing relationships ahead of tasks, by recognizing that relationships with impacted people and the leadership of impacted people has to be more important to us in a very serious way than any message we get about the campaign timeline, for example. So really what we strive to do, and obviously, you know, Peace and Justice Action League as an organization that is predominantly white continues to have lots of growing to do. We are increasingly multiracial as well as intergenerational and cross-class. So I'm not describing any of this as work that we have just figured out and we're done developing, but we seek to recognize the ways that we have a strategic imperative. Our mission is to build a just and nonviolent world, and we have to eradicate white supremacy culture and systemic racism in order to accomplish our mission. And I think that that's critical for all of our progressive organizations to understand that it's not about being nice or being kind or being moral even. It's about recognizing the strategic imperative. If we don't address racism and white supremacy culture as absolutely central, we are not going to win on climate change. We are not going to win on war because white people are manipulated by racism. We have to recognize it as our own self-interest as well.
Yeah, and it's possible to do the kinds of things you're talking about without blaming somebody for being white, but we need to just recognize that we're immersed in this. It's like fish don't have a concept of water, they're just immersed in it all the time. And so they're just in it, and they don't recognize the concept of water. And we are just immersed in this culture that is biased in a number of ways regarding race. and very often we don't see it. So it helps to have people lift up, hey, see what's going on here.
Right. None of us are responsible for the long ago past. Some of us have responsibility for the recent past, but we're all here now, and we all have responsibility for where we go from here. We have to recognize that it's holding both parts, that none of us asked to be socialized in these ways, and we have cognitive abilities that fish don't, and we have to be able to recognize this stuff that we're in and begin to spit it back out and clean it up and, clean up that behavior.
Right. So there's a difference between white guilt, which tends to suppress the kind of openness you're looking for, versus white responsibility, which is something we do need to take. So that instead of blaming somebody because they're white, recognize because we're white, we do have responsibilities, and we need to act upon this and lift up the humane values, act upon them, and organize. I want to get into a related issue about immigration, because we have a lot of racism imposed upon us by people who are wanting to hurt immigrants in various ways. All four of my grandparents were immigrants to the United States. They all came here with no money. They came here with no English language skills, but they were white, and so they were allowed to work hard and work their way into the American dream. And Trump's grandfather was an immigrant, a white immigrant. Two of Trump's three wives were white immigrants. But Trump focused his 2016 campaign and his whole first presidential term on urging people to hate and fear Latino immigrants and people who are from nations that have large Muslim populations. And Trump actually commanded a number of federal agencies to treat those kinds of people with extreme cruelty and injustice. And I just find that really offensive in so many ways. Glenn, when we were preparing for the program, you mentioned immigration as an issue. I wonder, could you lift up some humane values that could help us and our nation create strategies for good solutions? And we are tight on time, as I thought we might be. But can you lift up some values to help us with the immigration organization?
I'll just take one. All of the major religious traditions have a history and a lot of very explicit language in their documents saying to welcome the stranger, to welcome the person who's from another culture. And there are a lot of stories in the Old Testament of Jesus, of Buddha, doing that kind of reaching out to the person that is otherwise scapegoated or considered less valuable or considered not from us, but and the other. And it's just so explicit that I hardly need to go beyond that point. And I think most people realize that these are all really powerful traditions that have worked on these things for ages and all come to the same conclusion. And it's just breathtaking that we're able to get away with some of the ridiculous things that we've heard promoted and done in the past.
Yeah, I appreciate the work that you've been doing with Lutheran Peace Fellowship, and I'm also in touch with the national level of the Lutheran Church, the main Lutheran Church body nationwide. They've done some amazingly good, strong, ethical work based on humane values to protect immigrant rights. And I get their emails and click here to tell Congress to do this, or click here to tell Homeland Security Department to do that. I imagine that a number of other national level religious bodies are doing this. I know several that are. And so if somebody watching the program is connected with a national religious body, check out to see what they're doing for immigrant rights or racial justice or economic justice, and connect with them, because they need everyone's voice. One of the other problems that we're experiencing right now is a real upsurge of right-wing extremism, right-wing violence and cruelty, white nationalism, people that want to turn this into a white-dominated nation more explicitly, and efforts to impose right-wing Christianity upon the government and upon our society. And there's some other divisive efforts as well. Liz, I really appreciate the work that you and Pajals have been doing in Spokane to organize against these. Can you highlight something that how you see the problem, and especially how you've been organizing to deal with any kind of right-wing extremism?
Sure. There's quite a few examples to draw from. About 2 years ago, we became aware that the then chair of the county Republican Party had hosted a white nationalist organizer at a community event and essentially welcomed him as a nice young man. This is someone who was using what's called an entryist strategy to become a PCO in his county, a precinct committee officer within his county's Republican Party, and explicitly, openly, as a strategy to place himself in a position of power in order to influence party politics and as an organizing strategy. So we worked with about 20 other organizations to expose that and to call for the resignation of the leadership of the county Republican Party, and to create a situation where the less extreme leaders of that party and elected officials without party affiliation were for the first time, or at least for some of them for the first time, in a political landscape that made it essential for them to make clear where they stood with regards to white nationalism, which is not something that is normal, right? Like clarifying that you're not a white nationalist as an elected official is not something that that should be seen as like a normal activity. But we created a situation where it became essential for these folks to do it. We have also been involved in just quite a lot of education. We're seeing that there have been white nationalist organizing flyers put up at many campuses in and around Spokane to reach out to students, both high school and college students. So we've been doing quite a lot of education in the community and among our membership, including a webinar for parents to understand that, particularly during the pandemic, when young people are online so much more because they're home, the reality is that because of how much white nationalist propaganda and recruitment materials there are, and just kind of rhetoric circulating on the internet, whether it's YouTube or anywhere else really, that parents need to know what to be paying attention to and be ready to talk with their kids about what they may be seeing as an inoculation strategy, ideally, but also perhaps as a response strategy.
Yeah, there's so much of that, and it's so pervasive now in the executive branch, where Trump has appointed to very powerful positions a number of people who are just extremely racist and extremely negative toward human rights for people who are different from themselves, darker skinned or the wrong religion or something like that. And Trump has even been urging people, even during his campaign, his first campaign, to use violence. And he's really perverted some federal agencies, a number of federal agencies, into doing really cruel and oppressive things and denying people their human rights and constitutional rights. And I'm just very much alarmed about the threat to constitutional democracy nowadays. And I'm not trying to do this as a partisan rant, but I'm just seeing, if we're looking at the crises that are out and about in our society, I think we'd be negligent if we didn't address how much of that is coming out of the White House right now. And
Absolutely.
so anyway, I just wanted to mention that, because I wouldn't want people to think that, even though while a lot of what we're saying is quite bipartisan, both parties fail to do a number of things that are needed. Some of this really comes down really heavily out of the White House currently. There's another issue that's out there that's major, is the climate crisis. The escalating disruption of climates all around planet Earth, from the Arctic to the Antarctic and every place in between. Glen, when we were preparing for the program, you mentioned this as a concern. Can you say something about the climate? And then I'll ask if anybody can lift up any positive values or strategies to deal with this. And again, we're kind of tight on time, so we want to all be brief on this. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, most people know one or two of the features of climate change, but if you look at the list of serious problems and put them all down, it's really breathtaking. I mean, heat waves, droughts, floods, famine, hurricanes, displacement of refugees, increased mortality, access to clean water, shorter growing seasons for farmers in areas that are being hit, economic insecurity, deforestation, shrinking glaciers, insects dying out and going extinct, ones that are important for other purposes, tree die-offs. I mean, it's just endless. And several of them are, I've looked up the statistic on a couple of them. For example, by 2030, we will see 250,000 deaths per year due to climate change and various things that I've just mentioned. Or land degradation is currently affecting 23% of the entire global surface. And to imagine that it can only get worse is just shocking, I think, beyond belief. So I could go on, but that's a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, we're tight on time, quite tight on time, but there are some values that we can lift up. And when I've done work on this with people of different age groups, I've done work with high school students and all the way through the age brackets. A lot of people recognize that this is happening already. This is not just a future thing, but young people especially realize, hey, this is going to be the whole rest of my life dealing with this. Whereas those of us who are in our 70s, we've had lives thus far, but some people are just getting off and running. And so even in talking with older folks, they've got kids or grandkids that they need to care about, and we need to get beyond that. And these also, the climate crisis interacts with so much that we've already talked about these other issues. We do need to move on. I want to mention briefly just nuclear weapons, that besides the climate crisis that endangers human civilization here, nuclear weapons also endanger human civilization and actually most life on Earth. And when the Cold War ended 30 years ago, a lot of people stopped paying attention to nuclear weapons, but they've gotten worse in recent years. And it's been a bipartisan thing throughout the whole era from the 1940s on. And now the doomsday clock is the closest to midnight that it's ever been since it was created in 1953. We're very close to destroying most life on Earth. And I invite people to connect with the Olympia Coalition to abolish nuclear weapons. Gene and I worked on that along with a bunch of other good folks doing a lot of activities there. And we need to move on to the next thing I want to mention is that all of us have experience working with young people, and I appreciate Pajals has done a lot of work with a training program for young people, and Gene is active with the Western Washington Fellowship of Reconciliation, which also has a training program for young people. And so these are both really good things to be doing. And when we were on the phone to prepare for the program, Liz said, don't think of young people as the leaders of tomorrow. We've got young people who are the leaders right now today. That's a great insight. So don't be dismissive of young people and say, wait until you can become a leader in the future. Let's do what we can to make young people leaders right now. We've been talking some about the interrelationship among issues, and I do want to spend a bit more time on that, but we are significantly behind where I thought we'd be for the time frame. But Jean, can you tell us anything else about interrelatedness of these issues?
Well,
or if we said it all, we can move on.
I think when you bring up young people, I have been working with young people both in FOR and in the Thurston Climate Action Team. They have a strong group of young people who are just taking off and doing things, and they really see the intersectionality I was at a meeting where they said, well, everyone's talking about Black Lives Matter, so we can't talk about icebergs, but we can talk about environmental justice. And they said, we need to learn more about it. So they had someone come and teach them, and then they have scheduled a panel to discuss environmental justice because and to try to help people who are more concerned about their personal inequities and what their personal survival needs, to understand that it's important for them to also work on saving the climate and to support the people who do that.
Yeah, thanks. You know, with all these issues are so big, so heavy, so overwhelming that it's easy for people to feel pretty assaulted by all these issues, just overwhelmed by them, and to feel powerless and to feel despair, and then to get cynical. And when you do that, then you give away your power. If you're cynical about it, you say, screw it, why should I even bother to vote? Why should I do anything? Nothing matters, we're doomed. And if that's the case, they've already made up their decision, and they are dooming the rest of us. And all four of us are people who fight against the heavy odds and find creative ways to go about solving the problems. And so I'd like us to talk about that for just a bit. If people feel overwhelmed and despairing and cynical, that really is self-destructive and it's disempowering. And Glenn, a few days ago, you told me that instead of feeling overwhelmed and powerless, people need to recognize that folks have been taking positive steps toward better directions. Can you give us that insight?
Yeah, it's a very valuable thing to think what allowed activists in the past, even the recent past, to push through those things, powerlessness and feeling overwhelmed. What gave people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Cesar Chavez and Nelson Mandela and all the rest, the capacity to put all that energy in and to find the vision and strength and courage to persist in their efforts? We did an exhibit and list of 160 different movements for social change that were nonviolent and that were successful in significant ways. It's called the Path of Hope, and the Peace and Justice Resource Center version is the Wall of Hope. You can Google it, and it's just astonishing to see how much you can learn and how inspiring it is to just read how other people did what you're talking about here. What can we learn from these activists? You know, how can we work to improve our tactics or our strategy? One of the lessons is just taking small steps at first. It's an obvious one in some cases, but it's amazing how many people sort of put down those initial steps in a movement and not realize that that's how some people need to move forward. We have to have the courage to forgive people that make mistakes and to bring them in, to keep them in the movement that we're working on. There's really something profound by sort of building up what we believe in the work that we do. And for me, an awful lot can happen from reading story after story from the Underground Railroad and going way back into the medieval period to the present time, how people have worked out strategies and activities and experimented their way to things that finally worked, and use that as a way out of the kinds of barriers that so often hold social change back.
Right. Yeah. Gene Sharp has done a huge amount of research on that, and I've been reading Gene Sharp's materials, books and articles and things since 1976. First time I read his stuff, and I've become hooked on his writings, his research. And he, in the 70s, published a book that listed 198 different methods of nonviolent actions against oppressors and tyrants and dictators and invaders. And he says, here's just 198 that I've discovered. You folks are going to find a lot more, and a lot more people have. And so I've got resources about that on my blog, on the nonviolence part of my blog.
And it really makes sense to add Erica Chenoweth and
Yes.
Maria Stephan
Yeah.
produced a book entitled Why Civil Resistance Works.
Yeah.
And they did a very serious analysis of hundreds of social change activities, some violent, some nonviolent, and they found overwhelmingly that the nonviolent ones were more successful than the violent ones. And that kind of information can be really valuable at helping people really put their energy into what you're doing, right, and making a difference.
Yeah. In the 1980s, when President Reagan was just recklessly endangering the world with nuclear weapons, Joanna Macy wrote a book titled Despair and Personal Power in the Nuclear Age, and she conducted workshops about despair and empowerment. And now she's co-authored a book with Chris Johnstone titled Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. And Jean, you've been doing some work with that. The website for that is activehope.info. Jean, can you tell us just a bit about this briefly, and then we need to move on?
Well, Joanna has talked about the different times that of our society that we've been in, the business at the time of business as usual, and we're now moving rapidly through the great unraveling. But the goal is to move into the great turning, a time when we have a vision of a more sustainable society and continuing to be able to be humans on our planet. And her program emphasizes community and also emphasizes that individuals don't all have to march or don't all have to speak to their congresspeople, that there are many different things to do. And it's important to look and see what inspires you as an individual. And I've done some work with people in book groups on that, and it's very powerful to look at it that way, particularly in community. It's not like one person can go off and say, I'm going to do this because it's going to save the world. But as a group of committed citizens, as I think Margaret Mead said, we can. So,
yeah, I think that's important. And the website for that is activehope.info. And I'll be listing that and the book title and some other resources that some of you have mentioned on the blog. When I type up a thorough summary of what we said during this interview, I'll post that thorough summary to my blog, which is www.parallaxperspectives.org, along with the video so people can watch this TV interview again or share it with their friends. So there'll be a lot of resources there, including things we did not have time to mention here now. I want to just mention a little bit, even the vigil signs that we hold on street corners on Wednesday afternoons and Friday late afternoons in downtown Olympia affirm people's best values and try to welcome people in to us with sign messages that say, choose peace. All people are one human family. We all share one earth, and other things. And we get a tremendously positive response from people walking by or driving by who realize, wow, I can agree with that. I feel affirmed by that. And so we need to do things that welcome people in with good values. We also need to develop some good strategies and help people lift up their own good values. Most people do have a lot of good values, but those are so often suppressed by cynicism or people's failure to think that they can make a difference. They feel futility. But I'm convinced that ordinary people do have better values than what are running our society. And I'm convinced that in order to solve the nation's serious problems, we need to help people affirm, recognize, and then affirm and act upon the best values and devise strategies to help us do that. Really only vibrant grassroots movement like you folks have been talking about can solve the problems. And I'm going to flesh this out more with a thorough blog post because there's a lot that we just don't have time to say. We really do need to wrap this up. A lot of you folks have some good experiences and insights that I can share in the written summary of what we said during the interview, plus some additional notes that you folks had shared with me that I don't have time to say. But we really can do a lot more than people think. Voting is necessary, but it's not nearly enough. And democracy is something that happens all year round, not just on one day in November. We have to practice democracy as a vigorous bottom-up grassroots movement, and we can change things. And let's see, we're just about done. I will be listing on the blog a lot of sources of information. We just don't have time to get into these now, but there are a lot of sources of information about the crises that our nation is experiencing, about the dynamics of how to move beyond feelings of overwhelm and despair. There are resources about the values that we need to lift up and mobilize, and how to develop strategies and activities. Liz, you'd mentioned on the phone when we were preparing something that Tima Okun had written, and we don't have time to discuss it now, but it's really good stuff. And if you can send me the link, I'll include that as well, because we need these kinds of sources from people beyond the usual suspects. And so you'll see a lot of stuff on my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. Parallax has one R and two L's in it, .org. And there'll be some of the topics that we've mentioned briefly or not had time to mention. I've done whole full-hour TV programs on, and you can see some of those at the TV programs part, and also on the issues, a couple dozen different issue parts on nuclear weapons and climate and race and nonviolence and so forth. I want to thank Jean Gant de la Strada and Liz Moore and Van Gersmel. I want to thank all the people who've been watching this. Public opinion polls keep saying that most Americans think our country is headed in the wrong direction, and a number of things are terribly wrong and getting worse. And instead of just feeling defeated or trying to hide from reality, let's draw upon our best values, lift them up, and empower ourselves to organize with smart strategies from the grassroots up. And most elected officials, newspaper editorial boards, and other official power holders shy away from making the bold, humane changes for social and economic justice because they think those things are not politically feasible. Our job, the four of us plus all who are watching, our job is to change what is politically feasible to make a lot more good things politically feasible. So they'll say, well, of course, we've got to sharply reduce the policing. Of course, we've got to change the economics, and on and on and on. So we are the people we've been waiting for, as some folks have said. Let's do it. You can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence through my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. You can phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you specifically can do to help. Thanks to all of you.